The dojo on Route 9 had a reputation, and Marcus Tully had built it brick by brick with his own 2 fists. 34 years old, 6'2", 220 pounds of lean muscle wrapped in a third-degree black belt he'd earned the hard way, or so he told everyone who'd listen. He'd won regional tournaments. He'd trained under a sensei who trained under someone who'd supposedly trained in Okinawa itself. He had trophies lining the front window of Tully's martial arts academy, and he had something else too, a tongue sharp enough to cut steel. It was a Tuesday evening in late September when Walter Hines walked into the gas station on the corner of 5th and Birch, and that's where this story really begins. Walter was 61 years old, a farmer who'd worked the same 120 acres outside of town for almost 4 decades. His hands were thick and calloused, his shoulders permanently rounded from a lifetime of hauling feed sacks and wrestling with stubborn machinery. He wore the same faded flannel shirt most days, the same worn-out boots caked with dried mud, and he hardly ever said more than 10 words to anyone. People in town called him Silent Walt. Not because he was rude. Not because he was slow. He just didn't waste words. He'd nod at you in the grocery store, tip his hat if he had one on, and go about his business. Some folks thought he was simple. Some thought he was just tired, the kind of tired that settles into a man's bones after 40 years of physical labor and a wife who'd passed 8 years back, leaving him to run that farm alone with nothing but an old dog and his own thoughts for company. Marcus Tully had moved to town 3 years earlier, opened his dojo with a big bang. Banners, a ribbon cutting, a write-up in the local paper. He liked being seen. He liked being heard. And that Tuesday evening, after a hard class teaching 12-year-olds how to throw a roundhouse kick, he stopped at that same gas station to grab an energy drink before heading to dinner with 2 of his students' parents, a couple he was trying to impress into signing their kid up for the elite program, the one that cost $300 a month. Walter was at the counter paying for a bag of dog food and a gallon of milk when Marcus walked in, loud as ever, laughing at something on his phone. He glanced at Walter, really looked at him for the first time, even though they'd probably crossed paths a dozen times over the years, and something about the old farmer's quiet, unbothered presence rubbed him the wrong way. "Look at this guy," Marcus said to no one in particular, loud enough for the cashier and the 2 customers behind him to hear. "Built like he hasn't missed a barn raising in his life, but I bet he's never thrown a real punch." The cashier, a teenager named Dylan who worked there part-time, gave an awkward half-smile and said nothing. Walter didn't turn around. He just finished counting out his cash, exact change, the way he always did. Marcus wasn't done. He sauntered closer, energy drink in hand, that easy grin on his face that had charmed plenty of parents into expensive contracts. "No offense, old-timer," he said, clapping a hand on Walter's shoulder, uninvited, too familiar, the kind of touch that made the cashier's eyes widen. "But you look like easy money. I mean that as a compliment. You've probably got some serious functional strength under that flannel. Ever think about testing it against something real? Not hay bales. A real opponent." Walter turned his head slowly. His eyes were pale blue, weathered like old denim, and there was nothing in them, no anger, no offense, just a kind of distant patience, the look of a man who'd been underestimated his whole life and had stopped caring what people thought a long time ago. "No," Walter said. "One word." Then he picked up his dog food and his milk and walked toward the door. But Marcus, riding high on the attention of the 2 other customers who'd started watching now, wasn't satisfied. He followed Walter a few steps, still grinning. "Come on. I run a dojo 2 blocks from here. Tully's. You've probably seen the sign. I'll tell you what, I do this thing for the community sometimes. Charity sparring. I let regular folks come in, throw what they've got at me, see how long they last. Most people last about 4 seconds. You look like you might make it to 5. He laughed at his own joke. "Easy money, my man. I could use the entertainment." Walter paused at the door. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The gas station was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator cases and a radio playing low behind the counter. "You sure about that?" Walter finally asked. His voice was low, gravelly, unhurried. "100%, Marcus said, spreading his arms wide, soaking in the small audience he'd gathered. "Tell you what. You show up to my dojo Saturday morning, 10 a.m., open mat session, and you last more than 30 seconds against me, I'll refund every family in this town who's ever paid for a lesson at my school. That's how confident I am." It was a bold claim, the kind of thing said for effect, for laughs, never meant to actually be tested. Marcus had said things like this 100 times before to 100 different unsuspecting strangers, and not one of them had ever shown up. People didn't actually want to be embarrassed in public. That was the whole point of the dare. It was theater, not a real offer. Walter looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Saturday," Walter said. 10 a.m. And he walked out the door, the bell above it jingling behind him, leaving Marcus standing there a little stunned that the joke had actually landed somewhere real. What Marcus didn't know. What nobody in that gas station knew, because Walter never talked about it, never bragged, never even hinted at it in 40 years of living in that small town, was that Walter Hines hadn't always been a farmer. Long before the 120 acres, before the flannel shirts and the silence, Walter had spent 6 years of his life as a young man enlisted in the military, and during those 6 years, he'd been selected for a specialized combatives program that very few people outside of certain circles ever heard about. He'd trained for 2 of those years under instructors who taught hand-to-hand combat designed for one purpose only: ending a confrontation as quickly and decisively as possible, with no rules, no point system, no flashy forms, just brutal efficiency. After his service, Walter came home to help his aging father run the family farm. His father passed 2 years later, and Walter simply never left. He met his wife, Ruth, at a county fair the following spring. They married, worked the land together, built a quiet life. He never set foot in a dojo again. He never needed to. The skills he'd learned weren't about competition or trophies, they were about survival, and once he didn't need to survive anything more dangerous than a temperamental tractor or a bad winter, he simply let that part of himself go dormant. He didn't forget it. You don't forget something burned that deep into muscle memory. He just never had a reason to use it. Word got around town fast, small towns are like that. By Wednesday morning, half of Main Street had heard that Silent Walt was going to fight the karate guy on Saturday. By Thursday, people were placing friendly bets at the diner. Most of the town, frankly, expected Walter to either not show up at all or to show up and get embarrassed within seconds. Marcus was, after all, a legitimate black belt who taught dozens of students and competed regionally. Walter was a 61-year-old farmer who hadn't been seen jogging, lifting weights, or doing anything more athletic than loading his truck in years. Marcus, for his part, was thrilled. He posted about it on the dojo's social media page, carefully worded, of course, framed as a community engagement event rather than him mocking an old man at a gas station. He invited the local paper. He invited as many current and prospective students' parents as he could. This was free advertising, he figured, the kind of spectacle that would fill his enrollment for the elite program for months. He pictured himself sweeping Walter's legs in the first 10 seconds, the crowd laughing good-naturedly, everyone clapping Walter on the back for being a good sport, and then signing up their kids for lessons right then and there. Saturday morning arrived clear and cool, early autumn light slanting through the windows of Tully's Martial Arts Academy. By 9:45, the place was packed, more people than Marcus had ever seen in his dojo at once. Parents, kids and their GIs, curious neighbors, the local reporter with her notepad, even Dylan from the gas station, who told everyone at school about the exchange he'd witnessed. The mats had been cleared, the ropes that usually marked off sparring zones removed, leaving one open space in the center of the room. At 10 o'clock sharp, the front door opened, and Walter Hines walked in. He wasn't wearing anything special, just a plain gray t-shirt, sweatpants, and tennis shoes that looked like they'd been pulled from the back of a closet, probably bought a decade earlier for some forgotten purpose. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look excited. He looked the way he always looked, quiet, settled, present but unbothered, like a man checking livestock prices rather than a man about to face off against a trained martial artist in front of an audience. A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Marcus, already in his GI, his black belt cinched tight, flashed a grin toward the reporter and gave a small wave to Walter. "Glad you could make it, old-timer. You ready to have some fun?" Walter didn't answer right away. He walked to the edge of the mat, looked around at the crowd for a moment, not with fear, but with something closer to mild curiosity, like he was trying to remember why exactly he'd agreed to this. Then his eyes settled back on Marcus. "Ready," Walter said. Marcus turned to the crowd, milking the moment. "All right, everybody, let's keep this friendly. Light contact, controlled. I just want to show our friend here a little bit about real technique." Laughter rippled through some of the parents. A few of the kids in the front row were already giggling. They stepped onto the mat. Marcus immediately fell into a relaxed fighting stance, loose and confident, the posture of a man who had drilled this exact moment hundreds of times in sparring sessions and tournaments. Walter, by contrast, simply stood there. Feet shoulder-width apart, knees soft, hands loose at his sides. To the untrained eye in that room, it looked like he didn't know what he was doing. To the handful of people who might have recognized real fighting stances, and there weren't any in that crowd, it would have looked like exactly what it was, a man who didn't need a stance because he wasn't planning on dancing around. He was planning on ending things immediately if it came to that. "Whenever you're ready," Marcus said, still grinning, glancing once more at the reporter to make sure she was getting good footage on her phone. He moved first. A testing jab, not even a real attempt, just a light probe to see how Walter would react, the kind of opening move you'd use against a complete novice to gauge their reflexes. Walter's hand came up and intercepted it. Not a flashy block. Not a karate movie deflection. Just a small, economical redirection, his palm catching Marcus's wrist and guiding it half an inch off its line, so subtle that half the crowd didn't even register it had happened. Marcus blinked. He hadn't expected contact that clean from someone who was supposed to be a punchline. He recovered fast, though. He was a professional, after all, and threw a real combination this time: jab, cross, an attempt at a leg kick, all delivered with the speed and snap of someone who'd put in thousands of hours on a heavy bag. What happened next took less than 2 seconds, and almost nobody in that room fully processed it until it was already over. Walter didn't retreat. He didn't try to block each strike individually the way a traditional martial artist might. Instead, he stepped directly into the space between Marcus's first and second strike, a gap most fighters wouldn't even think to occupy because conventional wisdom says you create distance, not close it, and in doing so, he simultaneously took away Marcus's leverage on the cross and put himself in immediate, overwhelming proximity. His left hand swept Marcus's lead arm aside while his right forearm came up under Marcus's chin, not a strike, just pressure, controlled and total, and his hip rotated into Marcus's center of balance. Marcus's feet left the mat for a fraction of a second. Not dramatically. There was no spinning throw, no movie flip. Just a clean, brutal off-balancing that planted him flat on his back with Walter's knee resting, lightly but unmistakably, against his sternum, and Walter's hand positioned at his throat in a way that needed no explanation to anyone who understood what they were looking at. The entire room went silent. Marcus lay there, stunned, the wind partially knocked out of him, staring up into Walter's pale blue eyes, which held the exact same expression they'd held the entire time. Calm, distant, almost bored. 3 seconds passed. Then 5. Walter eased his weight back, removed his knee, and offered Marcus a hand up. Marcus, dazed, took it. Nobody in the crowd said a word for a long moment. Then one of the kids in the front row, maybe 7 years old, GI too big for him, broke the silence by asking loudly, "Mister, how'd you do that?" Walter looked at the boy. For the first time that morning, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Wasn't trying to do anything fancy, son," he said. "Just trying to make sure he didn't get the chance to do anything to me." Marcus, still catching his breath, sat up on the mat, his face a complicated mixture of shock, embarrassment, and something else, a dawning recognition that he had completely misjudged the man standing in front of him. He looked up at Walter. "Where did you learn that?" Walter shrugged, the same easy, economical gesture he did everything with. "Long time ago. Different life." He extended a hand again, this time not to help Marcus up but simply as a gesture, and Marcus shook it, slower this time, more carefully, the way you shake hands with someone you've badly underestimated. The reporter, who'd captured the entire thing on video, would later post the footage online, where it would rack up nearly 2 million views within a week, with a caption reading simply, "Never judge a quiet man." The comments section filled up fast. People sharing their own stories of underestimating quiet, unassuming people in their lives, veterans recognizing the specific style of close-quarters control Walter had used, martial artists analyzing the footage frame by frame, debating exactly what system he might have trained in. But the real story, the one that mattered most, happened in the weeks after. Marcus didn't get angry. To his credit, and people in town would later say this was the moment they actually started respecting him. He didn't make excuses, didn't claim it was a fluke, didn't try to save face by challenging Walter to a rematch. Instead, 2 days later, he drove out to Walter's farm, found him in the barn fixing a fence post, and asked if they could talk. Walter listened, said little, the way he always did. Marcus apologized, genuinely, awkwardly, the apology of a man who wasn't used to admitting fault but was trying anyway. He said he'd built his whole identity around being the toughest guy in any room, that he'd opened his dojo as much for his own ego as for teaching anyone anything real, and that getting put on his back by a 61-year-old farmer in front of half the town had cracked something open in him that he was still trying to understand. Then he asked Walter the question that would change both of their lives over the following year: would he be willing to teach? Not compete, not perform, not be a spectacle, just teach. Marcus offered to bring him in as an instructor, told him he'd never met anyone with technique like that, technique built on actual necessity rather than tournament points. Walter was quiet for a long moment, looking out at his fields, the same 120 acres he'd worked alone since Ruth had passed, the silence of that farmhouse pressing in on him every evening in a way he'd never admitted to anyone. He thought about his days, which had grown smaller and quieter with each passing year, about how the only voice he heard most days belonged to his old dog or the radio he kept on for company. "Couple days a week," Walter finally said. "Not every day. And I'm not wearing one of those uniforms." Marcus laughed, the first real laugh he'd had in days. "Deal." It started slow. Walter would come in twice a week, watch Marcus's classes, occasionally step in to correct something. Not flashy technique, but the fundamentals nobody in modern martial arts schools bothered teaching anymore: real distance management, real situational awareness, the psychological side of de-escalation, knowing when not to fight at all. The kids in the youth classes were fascinated by him, this quiet old farmer who moved like water and explained everything in about a third as many words as Marcus used. By winter, Walter had become a fixture at Tully's Martial Arts Academy, teaching what eventually became known as the Saturday Sessions, practical self-defense classes geared not toward competition but toward real-world awareness, popular especially among the town's older residents, several of whom told Walter they finally felt like they understood what it meant to protect themselves without needing to throw a single punch. As for Marcus, he kept a single framed photo on the wall of his office, right next to his tournament trophies, a still frame pulled from that viral video, the moment Walter had him pinned to the mat. People who didn't know the story assumed it was some kind of joke or a humbling moment he'd framed for laughs. But Marcus knew better. He kept it there as a reminder. Not of the embarrassment. Not of losing in front of a crowd. He kept it there to remind himself, every single day, that the quietest person in the room is very often the one with nothing left to prove, and that real strength rarely needs to announce itself, rarely needs an audience, rarely needs to call anyone easy money, because the people who've actually been tested by life don't need to manufacture a fight to know exactly what they're capable of. Walter still works that farm today. He still doesn't say much. But every so often, on a Tuesday evening, you might find him at the gas station on 5th and Birch, picking up dog food and milk, nodding politely to whoever happens to walk in, and if you ask anyone in that town now, they'll tell you the same thing. Don't ever mistake his silence for weakness.